All right, welcome everyone to our inaugural launch of Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Amanda Kelly, and I am the Junior Risk Consultant at Plan to Protect. I am coming to you with a background in legal, paralegal, and HR studies, as well as numerous years of working in childcare, including taking care of my own little coworker, 2-year-old daughter of mine. So our goal with this podcast is to host weekly informational sessions, tackling topics of safety with a focus on achieving that really high, the highest standard of abuse prevention and protection for that vulnerable sector. So what we want to answer are those really, really pressing questions that arise around vulnerable sector protection, and to equip those organizations with what they really, really need to reach that highest standard. So these sessions, they're geared primarily to senior executives, program supervisors, leaders, educators, pastors, parents, caregivers of schools, churches, camps, daycares, community centers, sporting leagues, long-term residential centers, etc. This list goes on and on and on. And we're really, really happy to be working with Melodie Bissell, who is the president and CEO of Plan to Protect, who is going to be working with us to provide all of that information that we really need, and you need as an individual serving that vulnerable sector. Melodie is an absolute expert in her field, and she'll be covering the really important and crucial content as you need to know to successfully protect not only those that you serve, but also the organization as a whole. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Melodie Bissell.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to join you for this podcast. And as Amanda has said, our desire is to come alongside of you and provide coaching, case studies, and content in order to help you achieve the highest standard of abuse prevention and protection, to demonstrate your duty of care, to mitigate risk associated with working with the vulnerable sector within your organizations, to help you stay abreast of best practices in the industry. As Amanda said, this is the safest podcast on the internet, and together let's raise the bar on protection, help protect the innocence of children and the dignity of vulnerable adults. As a leader, your time is really precious and valuable, and we want to honor that valuable time by coming in for 20 to 30 minutes once a week, just to come alongside of you and help provide some of that professional development. We want to meet this need in your life and to honor that time in your life. So please send us your ideas and your suggestions. Let's get right into it. Amanda, what's our first question for this week?
All right, this is a good one, and it's one that we get a lot. So the question is, are organizations really at risk? And if so, what risks do they face? A lot of organizations that we work with, they'll describe themselves as like a tightly knit community. Everyone knows everyone, and that seems to be a really common reality. But it becomes a very harsh reality when we answer this question, because I think it's one that everyone really, really needs to be aware of. So, Melodie, are organizations really, really at risk?
Well, Amanda, after 25 years doing abuse prevention, having thousands of phone calls that have been called into our offices, having sold over 20,000 issues of Plan to Protect manual, yes, I can tell you we have heard the stories. Organizations are at risk. They're at risk of inappropriate interaction between their workers and the minors that they serve. They're at risk of embezzlement. Unfortunately, we've even heard of some organizations that some of our clients said have been at risk of even fatality. within their organization, of pastors that have engaged inappropriately with children and young people, people who have taken financial abuse within some of the seniors that they serve within their organizations, internet activity that's inappropriate. We've heard it all. We've heard of so much negligence and abuse, harm that has been done to children, youth, vulnerable adults, but also we've heard of volunteers and staff that have been accused of wrongful abuse, wrongful allegations of abuse.
So what I hear you saying is that there's a massive list of risks that organizations actually face. And this is for everyone, every organization, not just very large ones that have tons of volunteers and tons of staff members. So we're looking at things like, injury, harm, abuse, workplace safety, harassment, discrimination, liability, insurance coverage, loss of reputation, loss of financial revenue, numbers, morale, and especially now, even spread of the virus, if they're not taking the proper precautions. That's a very, very large risk. So you would think, though, that getting into this, leaders would be aware of all of these risks, especially if they're facing them every single day. Before even taking on any programming with the vulnerable sector, they should already have something implemented to be able to provide that right level or the highest level of protection for these individuals.
Well, you would think that, Amanda. I wish I could say that that was true even in my own life. What many of our audience do not know is Amanda and I have very similar backgrounds. Amanda, I wish I knew when I was 20. Well, actually, maybe I did know when I was 20, in my 20s, what you know today. But I really want to encourage you to not forget the lessons you're learning at this point in your life. As I said, Amanda and I have very similar backgrounds. Amanda has backgrounds in law and paralegal studies. And at the same age that Amanda is, I was working as a legal secretary, paralegal for 2 law firms in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I worked in litigation. And every day was like reading a novel, writing these briefs and going with my attorneys that I worked with to court and hearing these stories, hearing about the risks and the liability in the litigation. And you would have thought that I would have remembered all that, but somewhere along the line, when you end up working in different organizations, you forget some of the lessons you learned early in your life. And so, Amanda, I want to encourage you not to forget these lessons about the risks that organizations face. I even know with my own children, when I put them into programs, I didn't ask some of those important questions that I certainly would ask today if I had children or grandchildren.
Yeah, and it's funny because before I had started at Plan to Protect, I even enrolled my daughter into a daycare, and I didn't ask those questions. And in the end, it did sort of backfire. There were a lot of red flags that I started noticing, and especially during my time at Plan to Protect, I really started noticing. So I'd be looking out, and then I started asking those questions, and I wasn't getting the answers that I was looking for. But when we did decide to change her daycare, that's when I asked those questions, when those really pressing questions that I should have asked at the very beginning. And I think that's really unfortunate that a lot of people don't have that kind of awareness to really be asking those questions. So essentially they could be putting their child into risk without knowing that information. So I think that's really, really important. And I know it's not something that I'm going to forget at all, especially because I did end up learning from it to really be making sure that those protocols are in place, especially to protect my own child.
Good for you, Amanda. 20 years ago, it was probably 20 years ago now, I became an executive director of a charity, and we worked with 50,000 children every year. I had over 1,000 volunteers. I had 35 staff and another 60 summer staff and interns that would work with us. And, one of my worst nightmares would have been if a child had been abused under my watch. So you would have thought that I would have taken those lessons that I had learned as a legal secretary and as a paralegal into that organization.
So then what happened? Like, did you get a wake-up call that kind of went like, hey, Melodie?
Well, thankfully, there wasn't an incident of abuse, but I did have a couple wake-up calls. My wake-up call was actually when the insurance company reached out to me and asked me what we were doing to protect the children under our watch. And they asked me to fill out a declaration form indicating that we were protecting the children and the young people under our watch. And I knew that I had to leave some of those questions blank. I was pretty arrogant at the time, probably pretty confident, thinking, of course we protect the children. I think if you ask any leader, they would say, absolutely, they protect the kids, or they protect those that they serve. They protect their staff members. But it wasn't until I filled out that application with the insurance company that I realized that I couldn't answer yes to all those questions. Now, thankfully, as I said, from what I know, there was not abuse under my watch, but I did hear of some organizations similar to ours where there was abuse under the watch. And I just know probably one small scare that I had is when I was looking at criminal record checks one day, back 20 years ago. That was when everyone started screening their volunteers. And unfortunately, I, like many others, thought that so long as I did a criminal record check, we were good to go. We were a safe organization. But I was looking at criminal background checks that day, and I saw one that had come up as positive. And I was behind on paperwork, and I looked at this positive criminal record check, and it was one of our host families that was actually hosting 2 of our summer students, and he had been accused of sexually abusing his daughter. And wow, was that a bit of a wake-up call for me. Thankfully, there was no abuse that had happened, but I think we sometimes even assume that when we do screening that every one of the criminal record checks are going to come back negative, but that day it was positive.
That's terrifying. So then what ended up happening?
Well, for me at the time, I actually was quite upset with the insurance company, the fact that they were going to put our insurance on hold, and they did put our insurance on hold. And I was quite angry and upset with the insurance company. But my board of directors said to me, no, Melodie, we need abuse coverage. You see, abuse coverage is not just something that you can buy, but you have to qualify for it. And the insurance company states that there are 7 things that you need to have in place to ensure that you are protecting those within your organization and protecting your staff and volunteers. So my board they were the ones that said, no, Melodie, you must make this a priority. So for me, with probably dragging my feet a little bit, I started to put those protocols and policies and procedures in place, started doing a lot of research. And so that's what I would encourage any organization to do.
So just quickly, you did reference those 7 steps. For our listeners, would you mind going over those steps really quickly?
Absolutely. Over in the future with some of our podcasts, we're going to unpack these a lot more for you. But those 7 steps are so important for us to remember, and they really make up that high standard of protection that we're recommending at Plan to Protect. So the first standard is having customized policies, policies that the board have put in place, policies that really are reflective of your organization, your vision and your mission, your commitment to protection. The second standard has to do with defining of abuse, defining the different categories of abuse, making sure that everyone, all the stakeholders are on the same page, understanding what abuse is, what physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, harassment, discrimination, inappropriate touch. Those are those important definitions that need to be put on paper and taught. The third standard has to do with screening your volunteers and staff. That means screening anyone in a position of leadership, screening anyone that interacts with the vulnerable sector, and screening goes way beyond just a criminal record check. And we'll talk more about this in the future, but we actually say there's many, many steps to screening and steps that you should do even before you get to that criminal record check. The next standard has to do with training your volunteers and staff, taking those policies that you have developed and training your volunteers and staff on those policies. And also another standard is operating procedures, making sure that we're all doing things the same way. So if you're going to take kids on an off-site trip, that you make sure that permission is granted from the organization prior to going on the off-site trip, making sure that you get permission from parents well in advance, using letters of informed consent, taking kids to the washroom, doing online engagement, even transitioning back from COVID-19, that we're all on the same page and we're going to follow the same process. The next standard has to do with modifying your premises, making sure you've got clear sights into the classrooms, that doors be kept open, that doors to the outside are locked if they're on children's wings, that storage closets and rooms are locked when not in use, and that there's a mechanism for feedback. That's the sixth standard. And the seventh standard is reporting and responding to abuse, making sure you've got a protocol in place for reporting and responding to abuse. I did that list pretty quickly, Amanda, but we're going to unpack those more in the future, I'm sure.
Oh, definitely. We will absolutely be really digging into those steps because we want to be able to equip organizations with the kind of information that they need to be able to implement these kinds of practices to really be protecting those that they're serving. I did want to ask though, because we are kind of starting out, where would organizations start?
Great question. So we've really addressed the question as to, are they at risk? And yes, organizations are at risk. So I would suggest that you do what I do. Don't just immediately put policies and procedures in place, but I think you really have to get your head around the fact that abuse does happen and that you are at risk. And for me, the way that I really came to terms with this was reading the lived stories and the experiences of those that had been abused. For me, that's where the real paradigm shift change happened for me. So it wasn't just about trying to qualify for abuse coverage or to combat litigation, but really to understand the impact, the cost of abuse. So read those stories, read articles, do Google alerts, read the biographies of individuals that have been abused. There's so many excellent ones out there. I'm just going to name just a few of them for you that I would really recommend. Andrea wrote a book, called Invisible Target, Andrea Clemens. It's on abuse within schools. Rachel Den Hollander, who was abused within the U.S. gymnastics. We've been hearing about that on the news, even just this weekend. Another USA gymnastics coach has been accused of abuse. Rachel Den Hollander wrote a book called What is a Girl Worth? An excellent, excellent book. Sheldon Kennedy wrote the book, Why I Didn't Tell. And Sheldon was abused by his junior coach, hockey coach. Excellent book. Uh, Mary DeMuth was abused by teenagers. And she wrote a book called We Too. Those are just a few of the really, really good books that are biographies of individuals that were abused. And I would say start off there. And then once you've read a few of these stories, then I would say pick up a copy of Plan to Protect manual, read through the manual, understand what a high standard of abuse prevention looks like, that protection looks like. And then we're going to help you in weeks to come on what else you should put into place to protect your organization and protect those that you serve.
Perfect. So I know that you've really been one that has unfortunately gotten to see the very dark side of risk and what that presents for vulnerable persons. So if you had the opportunity to sit down with your 20-year-old self after knowing everything that you know now, what would you tell yourself?
That our children and our elderly and those that have disabilities are at great risk of abuse, and that we can make a difference. We can make a huge difference in the life of a child, a youth, or vulnerable adult. Amanda, I remember my grandma, who was probably one of the most precious people in my life. In my 20s, I would go to visit her in a long-term care facility, and she would beg me to take her out of there, and she would say terrible things were happening to her. I didn't believe her. I didn't take her serious. I chalked it up to dementia or Alzheimer's. I wish I knew then what I know now, and I would believe individuals that tell me that they are being harmed. And I would make sure I was doing everything I could, not just to do the minimum. We often hear that organizations will say, what's the minimum I have to do? No, we should be achieving the highest standard of protection. Our children and our elderly and those with disabilities, they deserve that. That's what I would tell my 20-year-old self.
I think that's something that's really important for everyone to be recognizing. No matter what age you're at, if you're helping to serve in the vulnerable sector, you should know what's actually presented in terms of risk. I know because you referenced when individuals are like, what's the minimum that I can do? That's kind of like saying, okay, say you have 50 youth, how many of those youth would you protect? Not all of them, because if you're just doing the minimum, you might not be protecting all of them. So it's one of those questions that's like, come on, we should all be on the same page. You know, the place that we should be starting is with awareness. Everyone should be knowing these risks. We see these things come up every day in the news. Just recently, there was the ruling on the school board in Lindsay. So it happens in places that even you would think would be really, really, really safe, because it's just part of your community. You know the teachers, you know the EAs, you know everybody that's part of it, you know the kids that your child is interacting with. But even if you know these people, this can still be happening, as we've seen in cases that continue to arise. Even in the one that I've just referenced, it was years and years and years ago. But this person, she was not, she wasn't believed, she wasn't given help. There was nothing for her, no resources for her. So that would have affected her entire life. And that's exactly it. It happens. It might just happen one time. It might happen a number of times, but no matter what, it's going to affect that person's entire life. It's not just in the moment that it's going to affect them. It's something that they carry for until their last day. It's really, really upsetting, really unfortunate. And we do have tools to be able to prevent that. Like, of course, we can't say that it'll be impossible, but at least, you know, we're really managing that risk, because we even went over the list. There's tons upon tons of things that really need to be paid attention to, that there need to be protocols around that we need to be implementing. So I think this is a good place to end today. I do want to say that the podcast today, it is sponsored by the Plan to Protect Manual. I have it right here. If you don't already have the Plan to Protect Manual, what we like to call it is an encyclopedia of best practices. So within it, I'll just open it up. You'll see different kinds of procedures, some examples of what you should be putting into your policies, how they're applied. So it's broken down, each section. It's broken down into the policy, the plan, and then the protection section. So it's the information behind the policy, why it needs to be implemented. There's the plan of how you're going to implement it, and then there's a policy itself. So you can purchase this through our website. You can purchase it on Amazon. It also has a really, really handy back section of appendices. So examples of different forms that you can be using. I'll just open it up to one of them. So ministry personnel application forms. So an example of what those look like. You can take these, you can customize them and put them into your policies so you have them. Also, if you purchase the manual, there is a code at the beginning of the first couple of pages. It's a bolded code, and you can use that code to access the appendices online too, so you can just download them from there. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Melodie so much for helping us out today, giving us a really good idea of what is actually presented in our organizations in terms of risk and what we're facing on our day-to-day. I really hope that this has woken some people up, maybe given a bit of a reality check, because this is something that everyone needs to be on the same page for. Melodie, do you have any last words you'd like to share?
No, but I want to encourage you to send in your questions, send in your suggestions for content for the podcast. Amanda and I will be back here every week to be able to continue to provide you great content. We really do believe we are the safest podcast on the internet.
All right, thanks everyone, and we hope you have a fantastic day, and we will see you next week.